NHS England warning of continued disruption to GP services well into next week, as organisations around the world are still dealing with the fallout of that massive IT outage on Friday.
Yes, and despite a fix being issued across Microsoft Windows PCs, the cybersecurity firm Crowdstrike has said the systems would take some time to be fully restored. Well, we're joined now by Dan Prince, who's a professor of cybersecurity at Lancaster University. Thanks for coming in, Dan. So some time to fix. Is there any indication of what that time frame might be?
Well, the problem is with the software that's gone wrong, it's basically the guard on the computers. And so it's so interconnected with the core of the operating system, the brain of the computer, that it's stopping it from talking to everything else. So that means that people are going to have to go around and actually manually fix the computers. And so that will take time going to all the computers. And one of the challenges, a lot of the computers are in inaccessible places, so it can be quite tricky to apply the fixes.
It is astonishing that something that can be rolled out automatically, that went to all of these computers, causing the problem in the first place, then needs a very manual intervention. So someone going in and actually typing it. It's about deleting a bit of code, I think,
that's
isn't
right,
it?
Yeah.
People will be astonished that we have such a reliance on so many of these machines, and yet the fix is something that's very manual.
Well, that's part of the issue with this cybersecurity software, which is one of the reasons why we have it, is to protect against the issues that we have of people targeting the systems. And because of that, it's such an integral part of the computers that we use, that because it's gone wrong, it now is just not letting the computers run. And the resilience part is something a lot of commentators have been talking about, because it is so important, and we see how much this technology is embedded in our lives. And within the King's speech, there's a new bill that's been announced about cybersecurity and resiliency. And so it'd be interesting to see how much that resiliency then starts, the discussion around this bill, then starts to look at these types of outages. So
what can be done to improve that resilience then? Because are there any lessons to be learnt on the impact that this has had in terms of trying to prevent it happening again?
Well, funnily enough, this is one of the things I was talking to my students on our cyber leadership courses recently about, is how do we prepare for these types of risks, and how do we imagine these types of risks, and how do we develop the leadership capability within organisations to be able to respond. I think that's one of the key things. We're focusing a lot on the technology aspects, but really, actually, there's a lot of people in these organisations that can really enable a quicker response to get these services up and running. So how do we think about the resiliency within the organisations, not just the technology? How do we do the backups? How do we switch over to pen and paper if we need to? These are the key issues that we need to think about when these types of risks occur.
And when something of this magnitude happens as well, inevitably people will be talking about compensation, about who is responsible, who picks up the bill. We know that people, for example, that have had flights disrupted aren't automatically entitled to compensation because it wasn't the airline's fault. Does this all just go back to Crowdstrike? Are they going to have to put their hand in their pocket and pay out a lot of cash here?
Well, it's a really interesting question, because this is really the first type of issue like this where it's not been a breach as such, so it's not been targeted or hacked. It's a mistake the company has made. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens, but it's also a really interesting question for the insurers, because we're seeing a lot of cyber insurance, and coupled with the fact that computers are so integral to businesses, trying to understand and unpick what it means for insurers, because I'm sure CrowdStrike have insurance, trying to unpick what that means and whether the insurance can pay out. It's going to be a real issue, I think, going forward.
And Dan, I know you mentioned that the fix has to be done manually, so it will be a potentially slow process. And we've heard that some elements of the NHS that have been affected by this are starting to come back. But do we know how long it will take to recover things fully? I mean, ballpark, are we talking days more, weeks more?
Well, we're already seeing the critical services coming up, and I think what we'll see is a number of days, over a number of weeks potentially, for some of the more adjacent types of technology or services to come back up online. And I think we're seeing organisations prioritising the really key services that they need to get up and running for patients and for passengers. But it is a real challenge, because you have to basically at the moment go to every single machine and do it manually, because the failure in the CrowdStrike software is preventing those computers talking on the network. So we can't send messages to them to try and fix the problem.
And what does it say about, what our backup plans currently look like and what they should be? I mean, you talked about things like pen and paper, but we know increasingly so much is put online, even in the cloud. It's not even stored on a local computer, is it? What does a backup system look like? Because quite clearly, I mean, if we're talking in a medical setting, it's about patient records. It's about really vital, valuable information. If you don't have access to that, how do you do the job?
Again, it's a really challenging problem. We've seen this with the hospital attack in London with the Synovus breach, where we weren't able to, or the hospitals weren't able to use the blood supplies they've had because they weren't able to access the records. And so we really need to think through these backup processes. And I think, and I hope that this incident will get a lot of organisations thinking about that kind of recovery process and prioritising and thinking through the organisation and the processes they need to put in place to be able to do this. And I think some organisations are thinking about it, but probably not enough.
And there must be relief that this wasn't a malicious attack, that this was just a human error, essentially.
Yeah, but for people like myself who study cybersecurity risk, it's really interesting to be able to see that kind of impact so that we can understand what it might look like if it was an actual cyber attack. But the fact that it wasn't at the moment helps us to give us a bit of relief, but it gives us good data points and understanding about what might happen if a malicious actor decided to try and do something like this.
So useful for something at least. Dan, good to have you with us. Thank you very much. Dan Prince there.